Hello everyone, welcome back TV spoilers. Matt didn't run like a desperate man stumbling through darkness. He escaped like someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. As if every day of being cornered in Genoa City had only been a prologue to the disappearance. He believed he deserved to execute flawlessly. A loose coat to blur his silhouette, a cap pulled low enough to break his gaze under the brim. Shoes chosen for their ordinary sameness, and a posture that shifted from street to street. Corner to corner, breath to breath. Matt understood that in a town like Genoa City where rumors sprint faster than squad cars, and suspicion can kill before a bullet ever does, the most dangerous thing isn't the cameras. It's people's memory. So he gave them nothing to recognize. He severed the old image of himself and replaced it with a neutral shadow. The kind you'd forget the moment it passed. Just another man heading home after work, carrying the exact amount of exhaustion required to keep strangers from asking questions. Across town, panic spread not through shouting but through sudden silence. Calls piled up, footsteps sharpened in hallways, doors closed harder than usual, and glances traded without explanation. The police lost Matt not simply because he vanished, but because every trace of him felt scrubbed from the surface of the city, as if an unseen hand had wiped the board clean. Roadblocks turned up nothing. Checkpoints saw no sign of him. Leads that felt solid dissolved into sand. Genoa City became a maze where the fugitive knew every exit, and the hunters were left with useless maps and swelling frustration. Jack wasn't easily dragged into panic, but this time felt different. It wasn't a business crisis he could break down into data, risk, and decisions. It was a living absence, a disappearance that smelled like threat, making everything he thought he controlled suddenly feel fragile. Jack felt like he was standing in an empty room with the door slammed behind him. And somewhere in that quiet he could almost hear Matt's thin laugh, as if Matt was proving no one truly cages him. No one truly blocks him when he's decided to move. Jack's anger didn't explode into reckless action, it compressed, tight and heavy in his chest. He hated being played. He hated even more the possibility that someone outside his reach was dictating the tempo of this hunt. Victor didn't need anyone to tell him this wasn't just an escape. It was a challenge. To him, Matt wasn't merely a criminal, it was chaos capable of shaking deals, threatening secrets, and most importantly, forcing Victor's family into a reactive stance. Victor despised being reactive the way he despised losing. His panic didn't look like fear, it looked like the cold burn of power being insulted. He saw it in pure strategy. If Matt vanished this cleanly, someone opened a door for him. And whoever opened that door was either foolish, reckless, or intimately connected. The third possibility irritated Victor most because it implied a network he hadn't broken, a line of loyalty he hadn't severed. Victor didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in motives. And motives, in his experience, always circled back to love, money, or fear. Nick was trapped in the middle as usual, but this time the trap smelled sharper, more dangerous. He wasn't only worried because Matt was free. He was worried because that freedom would trigger consequences no one was ready for. Nick understood men like Matt the way someone does who stared down extreme survival instinct. Matt wouldn't disappear to stay gone forever. He disappeared to return differently in his timing, on ground where everyone else was weakest. Nick's panic wasn't fire, it was rising water. Quiet, heavy, slowing his thoughts because too many dark scenarios surfaced at once. He felt the pressure to protect, to prevent, to run faster than a disaster taking shape. He hated that even with their names, their connections, their power, they could still be turned into frantic responders by one fugitive's calculated absence. Then the question began spreading like a crack: who was backing Matt? Because in this world, a man like Matt doesn't simply vanish without help. The air in Genoa City thickened with suspicion. The police started watching each other. Reports were reopened. Details once dismissed became suddenly poisonous. A car that appeared at the wrong time. A logged call with no clear origin. A statement that sounded true but was missing one crucial piece. And through it all, Diane's name started surfacing like a shadow nobody wanted to touch. Because touching it meant dragging a dusty layer off the pastone everyone had pretended was sealed. At first it was only a faint line of reasoning. Something people avoided because it felt too sensitive. Diane wasn't just Diane. Diane was part of Jack's life, a symbol of choices, forgiveness, rebuilding trust after damage. Even saying her name in the same breath as backing Matt felt like breaking a taboo. But suspicion doesn't care about morality. It only needs logic. And the logic here was ruthless. Whoever helped Matt disappear would need calm, knowledge of the gaps, and above all, a connection deep enough to justify the risk. A stranger wouldn't do it. A new ally wouldn't trust enough. So it had to be someone from Matt's past, Simeone, who understood how he thinks, what he fears, what he needs, someone who could pull him through the dark at exactly the right moment. The truth surfaced not through confession but through fragments rising like debris after a storm. Diane had been Matt's former lover. That sentence alone made the room feel airless. Jack took it like a blow to the softest place in him he couldn't even name, much less admit. He sat there confronting a truth that was both familiar and foreign. Familiar because Diane had always carried a past he could never fully hold. Foreign because he had never imagined that past threaded through a name like Matt. A chill ran down his spine, not from jealousy, but from the feeling that he'd been placed in a game whose rules were written long before he arrived, had been living in the present, while the past still had roots under his feet. Somewhere else in Genoa City, Diane no longer looked like the confident figure everyone recognized. She carried a tension so thin it could snap at any breath. When news of Matt's disappearance spread, Diane didn't panic by running. She panicked by keeping her mask perfectly in place. For her, every glance could turn into a blade. She knew how this town worked. It didn't need proof to convict, it only needed a plausible story. And Diane, as Matt's former lover, was plausible enough to become a noose. But what terrified Diane more than being suspected was being seen differently by Jack. She feared the moment he realized there were parts of her that had never belonged to him. Parts he had never touched, parts that might never be his. The next shock cut deeper. Diane was the one who had saved Matt. No one wanted to believe it, yet the pieces fit too cleanly. Matt's disappearance was too surgical. The timing too exact. His confidence too smug. It all screamed he didn't run alone, it was pulled, shielded, guided through blind spots. And Diane, who always knew how to appear at the right moment to shift a situation, became a suspect no one could ignore. On the surface, people would assume Diane did it for an old love. The truth inside was more complicated, more painful, and more frightening. Diane didn't save Matt because she still loved him. She saved him because she understood what Matt could do when cornered. And she understood that a desperate Matt could collapse far too many structures sizzling the life she'd fought to build. The image she was still trying to protect in front of Jack, in front of Genoa City, and even in front of herself. Diane carried an impossible conflict. If she let Matt be caught again, maybe everything would end, but maybe a secret would be dragged into the light. A secret capable of burning her down. If she saved him, she could keep that secret buried a little longer. But she would step deeper into a road with no return. Diane chose to save him. Not because it was right, but because it was the only choice that still felt like control. In the quiet after a decision like that, Diane was left alone with herself. She remembered believing that the past could be locked away like a sealed box, that a new life would make it disappear. She was wrong. The past never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to rise and remind you that you can't outrun what made you. Matt, in Diane's story, wasn't only a former lover. He was a marker, a wound, the reason she learned to live by calculation instead of trust. And worst of all, Matt was the one person who knew a horrifying truth about Diane, something Jack had never known. Something that, if Jack ever learned it, would shatter what they had into something unrecognizable. Jack, facing the suspicion that Diane had helped Matt, wasn't only facing betrayal. He was facing how powerless he truly was to fully understand the woman beside him. Each good memory blurred under a new question. Who was Diane when she was with Matt? What had she done for Matt to hold that kind of leverage over her? And what had she carried from that history into the life she built with Jack? Jack didn't want to doubt, but he couldn't pretend he didn't see the fractures forming. He was furious because he'd been shoved into a position he never chose: trust her, or protect himself from her, defend Diane, or defend himself against Diane. In that moment, love wasn't shelter. It was a battlefield. Victor watched it all with a cold eye. He didn't care whether Diane loved Matt. He cared what Diane had handed him. A man like Matt, once rescued, doesn't simply live. He bargains, he threatens, he demands repayment. He hunts revenge. Victor understood that law. And he understood that whoever saved Matt had also given him a weapon that could be aimed at anyone at any time. When Victor looked at Jack, he saw a weakness that could be exploited. Jack would hesitate if Diane was dragged into the open. Nick would act on protective instinct. And the difference between them made Victor calculate faster, colder, because in war, the person who moves a beat late is the person who loses. Nick, caught inside the spreading suspicion, felt everything slipping. He didn't want Diane turned into a monster in the eyes of the town. But he couldn't deny how toxic her name sounded inside this story. He could also see how Jack might be crushed by the truth. Because Jack hadn't trusted Diane as a casual risk, had trusted her as a future. Victor, for all his strength, would become even more dangerous once challenged. And between those two men, Nick could feel himself forced into the role nobody wants, the one who stabilizes. The one who prevents the situation from detonating into all-out war. But how do you stabilize anything when the truth itself is explosive? Diane wasn't blind to what was coming. She felt the shift in the air the way you feel a storm before rain falls, an invisible pressure on the lungs. She knew Jack would look at her differently. She knew Victor wouldn't hesitate to crush her if it helped him control the situation. She knew Nick would be dragged in whether he wanted to be or not. And she knew Matt, even now, even hidden, would never truly leave her life again. Because Matt wasn't just running from the police. He was running from an ending written by other people. He wanted to rewrite it, and by saving him, Diane had unknowingly helped him write the first new line. The horrifying truth about Diane and Matt still wasn't spoken aloud, but it was present like a shadow pressing down on every conversation. Jack felt it in Diane's refusal to meet his eyes. Victor felt it in the stretches of silence between questions. Nick felt it in his own heartbeat spiking each time another update arrived. That Matt still hadn't been found. And Diane felt it most clearly, because she had carried that secret the longest, like a stone in her chest always, afraid the day would come when it dropped and crushed everything. Tension peaked when Diane saved Matt stopped being a whisper and became a fact everyone could taste. Genoa City began treating her differently, as if one rumor was enough to turn a person into a threat. Diane stood in familiar rooms and felt like an intruder. She kept her posture steady, her expression sharp, but inside she was drowning in regret and survival instinct. She wondered if she could undo this, if she could cut Matt out of her life a second time, or if this time Matt would drag her down with him. Jack, through sleepless nights, began to realize the most painful part wasn't that Diane had once belonged to Matt, it was that Diane had chosen not to tell him. Not telling him because she feared losing him, or because she wanted control, or because she believed he wasn't strong enough to handle it. Jack felt diminished, pushed outside the borders of the very life he'd built with her. And he knew if that secret was as horrifying as the air suggested, his love would be tested in the cruelest way, not simply by forgiving or leaving, but by choosing between truth and the illusion he'd been living inside. And Matt, somewhere no one expected, hadn't vanished from the story at all. He existed like a raw nerve in everyone's mind. The more the police searched, the more it felt like they were being led in circles. The more Jack fought for calm, the more he looked like a man tightening a noose round his own throat. The more Victor commanded, the more the world seemed to resist. The more Nick tried to hold everything together, the more it slipped through his fingers. Diane, the one who opened the door for Matt, began to understand she hadn't just rescued a man, she had unleashed a danger that knew exactly where to strike her weakest. In the end, the silence became the most dangerous weapon of all. Silence was the space where everyone filled the gaps with imagination. And imagination was always more brutal than truth. Jack began searching not for Matt, but for the answers Diane had hidden. Victor began rebuilding the entire picture, not to understand it, but to strike at the right moment. Nick began asking questions not to accuse, but to prepare for the blow he felt coming. Diane stood between them like someone holding a box that could explode, too afraid to open it, unable to throw it away because throwing it might detonate it instantly. And just when everyone believed they were only racing the clock to find Matt, a small sign appeared, cold, deliberate, and painfully familiar, like a reminder that Matt had never truly left Genoa City at all. He had only moved to a better vantage point to watch them panic from a distance. In that instant, Jack understood the worst part wasn't that Matt was hiding. It was that Matt was choosing his moment to return. And if Diane saved him once, this time Matt would demand a price so brutal Diane would lose the right to choose at all. Because the horrifying secret Jack never knew was finally approaching the door, ready to knock when everyone was weakest. Diane had grown used to walking into rooms full of watching eyes and reminding herself that, as long as her face stayed calm, everything would pass like a wave. But this time, it didn't feel like the other times. It wasn't a crisis she could smooth over with a practiced smile. Not a misunderstanding she could turn into an advantage with a few carefully chosen words. This was deeper, more persistent, because it pressed directly on the fear Diane had always tried to cover with confidence. The fear of being seen exactly as she is. The fear of being measured against someone else. And the fear that Jack's love for her isn't as solid as she has forced herself to believe. During the quiet days, Diane is trying to hide everything, but sometimes the truth doesn't need anyone to expose it. A single crack in a glance is enough for people to sense it exists. She knows Jack too well to misunderstand his silence. When he goes quiet, it isn't because he has forgotten, it's because he is crushing his feelings inside his mind, trying to reshape them into something he can live with. Jack has always wanted to believe in the good, to believe the woman beside him truly chose him, truly belongs with him. But Diane also knows Jack is not the kind of man who can lie to himself forever. And what unsettles her most isn't the gossip outside, not the eyes of Genoa City, but the simple, brutal truth that Nikki is still carved into Jack's heart in a way that won't ever fully disappear. Diane can defeat rivals with strategy, with image, with patience. But Nikki isn't that kind of rival. Nikki is memory, obligation. A piece of Jack's life built on loyalty and sacrifice so intense it nearly became self-destructs. The harder Diane tries to look composed, the more she feels dragged toward a weakness she refuses to admit. She begins to read every small gesture from Jack as a hidden signal, every pause as a verdict still forming. And when she realizes Jack still hasn't let go of Nikki, Diane doesn't only feel anxious, she feels offended. It isn't childish jealousy. It's the bitterness of a woman who has gambled everything on a new home, only to discover that home still has a locked room reserved for another woman. Diane asks herself how long she's expected to be patient, how much she's supposed to swallow, how far she has to bend to be seen as the only choice rather than the woman standing beside a memory that refuses to die. That is when Diane's familiar survival instinct rises up. When she feels pushed toward the edge, she doesn't choose to sit still and be crushed. She will find a way to push back against Jack, not because she hates him, but because she hates the feeling of being the replacement. Diane understands that if she lets Jack drift freely inside his nostalgia for Nikki, she will eventually become a temporary comfort, a safe option, while his heart still leans toward a past. She cannot tolerate that role, not out of pride alone, but out of fear of losing control. For Diane, losing control means losing everything, and she has lost too much already to accept that again. Diane's resistance doesn't require loud confrontations. It is subtler, colder, and more painful because it hides under the appearance of a wife protecting her marriage. She begins to draw new boundaries between Jack and Nikki, never necessarily spoken aloud, but felt like invisible restraints tightening. She does everything she can to remind Jack that his present is her, that they have built something Nikki has no right to step into. At the same time, Diane has to hide everything in her own way, hide the panic, hide the insecurity, hide the sting of comparison, and hide the truth that Jack's inability to forget Nikki is awakening a part of her. She always tries to bear the part, willing to fight to the end, even if it means hurting the man she loves. Jack isn't blind to it. He feels the shift in Diane the way someone feels the wind change before a storm. He may not say it, but he knows she's building walls, and that pulls Jack into a new conflict. On one side, responsibility, history, the kind of bond with Nikki that can't simply be erased. On the other, the present, the marriage he chose. Diane's standing right in front of him, loving him with a fierceness that sometimes makes him feel he can't breathe. Jack hates being split in two. He hates that any choice he makes can become evidence against him. He doesn't want to betray Diane, but he doesn't want to be cruel to Nikki either. And that hesitation, so human, so complicated, becomes the very thing that makes Diane feel pushed to the margins. Diane understands that this war is not truly about Nikki as a person, but about whether Jack belongs to the present at all. She hates admitting it, but the more she tries to deny it, the more she is haunted by one question: if Jack still hasn't forgotten Nikki, will he ever? There are nights Diane lies beside him and feels a cold space between them, not because Jack leaves her through actions, but because part of his mind is always leaning somewhere else. Diane tells herself she can't be soft. She can't become the woman who begs to be loved completely. So she chooses to fight. She chooses to push back. And in that choice, she becomes both the strong one and the most frightened one. For this ending, if I'm allowed to be honest for a moment as the writer standing at the edge of their story, I've always felt relationships like this hurt the most because no one is simply bad. Jack isn't wrong to carry obligation and memory for Nikki, because some years can't be shut like a door. Diane isn't wrong to feel wounded either, because everyone wants to be loved as the only choice, not the safest option. But what tightens my throat is the sense that they're approaching a line where love is no longer enough to heal, where each silence becomes another way of hurting each other. And I can't shake the feeling that the harder Diane tries to hide everything, the harder she fights Jack to hold her place, the more she may be unintentionally pushing Jack toward the very memory she fears most. If love turns into a battle for control, what is left besides exhaustion and doubt? The question that won't leave me like a small thorn stuck in the mind is this: when Diane takes one more step to push back against Jack, what will she choose in order to win? A truth spoken out loud, or a secret kept hidden? And will the price of that choice be something neither of them ever imagined they would have to pay? On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.